Bitcoin's decimation of its standard denomination in the US dollar continues to dictate its dwindling decline. But looking at the comparative strength of the dollar can be one of the best tools for our Bitcoin investing. Today we're going to be looking at the US dollar and its impact on BTC, and I'll try to less rely on alliteration to do so. And where better to start than the new BTC versus DXY chart we have on lookintobitcoin.com. And as you can immediately see, hopefully, there is some correlation between these two lines. Typically, we see one increase as the other is decreasing. Typically, as the US dollar index increases, we see drawn out bear cycles in the Bitcoin price. And vice versa, once we see the dollar index continue to rapidly decrease, we usually see Bitcoin have a fairly considerable bull cycle. And this has been majoritarily true for most of Bitcoin's price history. And this is just generally because we usually measure the strength of Bitcoin versus the US dollar. But how can we actually use this data to improve our investing? Because obviously in hindsight, it's easy to say if we'd have sold at the tops and bought at the bottoms, we'd have been doing great. But in hindsight, obviously it's not that useful. What we can actually do is look at something like the year-on-year rate of change of the dollar strength index, or the DXY, compared to Bitcoin, to see again that there is a very obvious correlation and really a great way we can actually use this metric, like we said, to improve our BTC investing. We can see once again there's a very clear correlation between very negative year-on-year growth for the dollar strength index and BTC's price action topping out. And once this year-on-year rate of change begins to peak, we can usually see Bitcoin's price action bottoming out, and before this declines, we usually see Bitcoin start to increase. Really, what we can look for, just due to the fact that the US dollar isn't nearly as volatile a currency as Bitcoin, as its trillions of dollars circulate around the globe, we can see that there are obvious areas where potentially investing in Bitcoin makes more sense, and potentially where taking profits again makes a little bit more sense. If we just draw on the zero line here, we can see that once the year-on-year rate of change for the dollar strength becomes incredibly negative, we can see that typically this is in the latter stages of a Bitcoin bull cycle, or at least giving us indications that maybe this is beginning to top out a little bit, because it's not like we need to look for immediate reactions in the dollar strength. We usually have a little bit of time to actually be actionable on these signals. For example, here, as Bitcoin topped out, there was a few months period where it actually took the DXY to turn from a downtrend in its year-on-year returns to maybe start curling up and becoming more positive in its year-on-year action. But we can see once this becomes negative, it usually indicates areas in which Bitcoin's likely to have a more sustained area of price action. Like we could see here, this actually begun to turn over pretty much at the Bitcoin bottom. Once this actually became negative, it really indicated that Bitcoin potentially had entered its transitionary period from bear cycle into bull cycle, and has maybe even kicked off the latter stages of this next BTC cycle. We can also see as well that there are potentially some areas of uptrends that we can see. So maybe in this cycle, maybe we don't see quite as much of an exponential price rise. Maybe we see more of a slow grind to the upside, especially as Bitcoin's market cap increases, the market matures, and the market in general just becomes a little bit less speculative and volatile. But maybe what we could see is the DXY actually come down to this line, break beneath it, which would really indicate that the dollar is comparatively losing a great amount of purchasing power across the globe, and that could really fuel the fire of a huge Bitcoin move to the upside. What we can also take into account is due to the fact that the US obviously has a huge influence on global markets, and the fact that global fiat currencies have a very strong correlation to the current state of the economy, which also ties into the amount of global liquidity we see. Generally, we can see, again, a pretty strong correlation between the year-on-year rate of change of the US dollar strength and global M2 money supplies. Again, once we see the US dollar typically decreasing quite rapidly in its strength, we usually see the global M2 money supply increasing. Now, countries will often purposefully decrease the strength of their currency to potentially incentivize greater exports and maybe stimulate the economy to maybe incentivize more lending, lowering interest rates, etc. So really, these are all metrics that are kind of tied in together. And once we see the global M2 money supply potentially start to decrease, and once we see the US dollar strength year-on-year price action begin to increase, this may be indicating that there's more bearish market conditions going forward. And again, on the vice versa, once we see this begin to turnover for the top and start decreasing, especially into negative territory on the year-on-year strength. Once we begin to see global M2 money supply start increasing very rapidly, we have a lot of confluence that the market conditions are becoming very bullish and favorable for more upside price action. And right now we can see, like we said, with the dollar strength being a little bit more stagnant, maybe we're coiling up for either maybe even a little bit of retracement in the Bitcoin price as the dollar regains some strength. Maybe we're waiting for a convincing break of this trend we've set on the year-on-year returns for the dollar strength. And this is reflective in the global M2 money supply, which has been pretty sideways for the past few months. So really what we'd like to see over the coming weeks and months is this start to turn to the upside, the dollar strength continuing to decrease, which would both really fuel a substantial Bitcoin move to the upside. And for further evidence that Bitcoin continues to decimate the US dollar in its purchasing power is we can look at how much $1 would buy you, or how many sats it would buy you throughout all of Bitcoin's price history. We could see it has gone from buying you multiple Bitcoin, bearing in mind one Satoshi is 100 millionth of a Bitcoin, so hundreds of millions of Satoshis, down to in 2017 the peak being able to buy just around 5,000 Satoshis with $1, to the most recent peak at just around $69,000, about 1,700 Satoshis, to where we are now, 2,900 Satoshis, $1 would buy you. And we can clearly see that this trend is to the downside as Bitcoin continues to increase its value exponentially versus all fiat currencies. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released. And make sure to check out all the resources we've discussed today, as well as the many more that are all available on lookintobitcoin.com, your #1 source for Bitcoin information. So just to summarize, Bitcoin typically experiences large upside moves as the US dollar strength index, or the DXY, is decreasing, like we're seeing now, and has drawn out bear cycles as the DXY is increasing just after the Bitcoin price action has peaked. And as the US has a very large impact on global markets, economies, and liquidity cycles, we usually see a strong correlation between the DXY and the M2 movements, both of the US M2 money supply and the global M2 money supply. The M2 money supply just being the total valuation of all cash and cash equivalents in circulation. And as the DXY continues to decrease in strength on a macro basis, it's likely we will see the purchasing power of the US dollar decrease against Bitcoin, like we saw with the amount of Satoshis $1 could buy just a few years ago compared to now. That is likely going to continue to decrease massively. If you like this video, then please visit lookintobitcoin.com, where you can also consider becoming a site subscriber to gain access to professional resolution charts, advanced macro and portfolio data tools, in-depth crypto industry reports, live and personalized indicator alerts, private TradingView scripts, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. And let me know in the comments down below, how do you think the US dollar is going to look in comparison to Bitcoin over the coming months and years? Like I said, let me know in the comments down below and on social media. I look forward to reading and replying to all of them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.